Hello, 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 everybody. We are back again with another uh discussion topic. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to go over to the chapter 7 lecture slides, and we're going to talk about classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning. So these are three different forms of learning that are discussed in the chapter, and they also tie into the chapter 7 discussion forum. So here we are. Let's take it away. All right, so learning in and of itself, what is learning? There's a few different definitions, but the working definition of learning is that learning is something that permanently alters a person's state, basically. So, whenever you learn something, it literally causes a change in your behaviors because you have learned whatever it is that you learned. And it also causes changes in your brain. So, either new connections are formed in your brain, or connections are altered, or connections are reinforced, strengthened, or weakened. But something happens in your brain every single time you learn something new. So that's what learning is in a nutshell. Now, in the chapter, it covers actually four basic forms of learning, but we're only going to focus on three since these three are the ones that are covered by the discussion forum. Okay, so the first one is classical conditioning. So, classical conditioning, also known as associative learning or one form of associative learning, is simply you're learning to associate one thing with another. So, you're learning to have something that you normally associate with something, and then you're adding a new association to that association that you previously had. So, all that probably sounded like a bunch of gibberish. So, let's break it down. So, within the concepts of classical conditioning, we have something called an unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, conditioned stimulus, and conditioned response. The unconditioned stimulus is something that you have an automatic reaction to. So, for example, if we just all of a sudden are sitting in the room watching a movie, minding our own business, and then we hear an extremely loud sound that just comes out of nowhere. Our first reaction is going to be to what? We're probably going to duck, our heart's going to start racing, we're probably going to like jump, we're probably going to look around to try to figure out where the sound came from. All those reactions that we have automatically to that stimulus of having a random sound just come out of nowhere is a perfect demonstration of what an unconditioned stimulus and unconditioned response are. So you hear a loud sound that comes out of nowhere, that's the unconditioned stimulus. You jump, you look around, your heart races, all of that, that is the unconditioned response. So unconditioned stimulus is something that you don't have to be trained to react to, you just react to it automatically. And then the unconditioned response is your reaction to that stimulus. Now, with classical conditioning, what we're doing is we're introducing something called a conditioned stimulus to the mix. So the conditioned stimulus is something that you don't have a natural reaction to. So, like, there's no normal reaction to this thing, you're just it's just a part of everyday life. So, for example, let's say that you're watching that same movie and your friend walks in the door. Like, your friend knocks on the door, walks in, you start having a good time. There's no necessarily, conditioned stimulus to that because, your friend just came over, this could be an everyday occurrence for you. But when you start to pair the unconditioned stimulus with a conditioned stimulus, that's when change occurs and that's when learning occurs. So let's say that you hear this loud, crazy, sudden sound, and then your friend knocks on the door, and it happens like almost simultaneously. What can happen from that experience is that the next time your friend knocks on the door, you could start feeling your heart race because the last time they knock on the door, they had this crazy sound associated with them. So that would be an example of a conditioned stimulus. So now you're starting to have a different reaction to something that you normally just had an everyday reaction to. So that is classical conditioning in a nutshell. The way that it actually started out was with a man named Ivan Pavlov. He was actually working with dogs in his laboratory and he was measuring their digestive system. He actually won a Nobel Peace Prize for his work. But one day while he was working with his dogs, he noticed that one day, the person who brought the food to feed the dogs started to salivate as soon as they saw this person. So he's like, what's going on with this? Why are they salivating as soon as they see this person who is bringing them food? So he's decided that he had stumbled upon something new. He had discovered a new discovery. So the dogs would naturally start salivating when they have food in their mouths. But if there's no food in their mouth and they're salivating when the person comes to bring them food, something must have occurred. So that's where he started to do his experiments and tried to see if it was true that he uncovered something new. And if there was something that he uncovered that was new, could he potentially manipulate it to have the dogs salivate from something else? So that's where his study was born. So essentially it worked, and that's why we're talking about classical conditioning to this day. But what he did was he started with different things in the atmosphere. So once he saw that they were salivating to the person that came into the room, he decided, okay, they're salivating from that. Let's see if I can teach them to salivate off of the ticking of a metronome. So he started ticking the metronome and then giving the dog the food, ticking the metronome and then giving the dog the food, doing that over and over and over again, essentially. And then what ended up happening was as soon as that metronome started ticking, the dog started to salivate because now the dog had acquired a reaction to the metronome ticking because they developed an expectation that food was coming. So before, the person walking in the door that very first time to bring them the food, they probably had no reaction whatsoever. But over time, if the person came the same time every single day, they're always wearing the same outfit, they always come with food in a bag, et cetera, sooner or later, the dog starts to form a reaction to that. Same thing happened with the metronome. When you start clicking in the metronome the first time, the dog has no response whatsoever. But after you do it repeatedly with pairing it with food, then the dog learns, okay, this metronome is ticking, that means food is coming, therefore salivation occurs. Um, he manipulated this in a number of different ways, and every way that he did it, he found that it pretty much worked. If you pair something that is neutral with something that causes an automatic reaction, you then start to cause an automatic reaction for that once neutral thing. So that's classical conditioning in a nutshell. Another researcher came along after this and he said, I like what you did with those dogs, but let's see if you could do this with a human. So, John Watson, he wanted to see if he could condition emotions in humans. So, he was like, "I believe that I can condition just like a physical reaction can be conditioned, I can condition an emotional reaction." So, he decided to choose an emotion, and the emotion that he settled upon was fear. And he decided to choose a human that wouldn't have had much experience with emotions because remember, you have to have something that is neutral to humans, et cetera, et cetera. So, he was like, how about an infant? How about a kid? How about a baby? Why don't I get a baby and condition this child to be afraid? That sounds kinda sadistic, but that's exactly what he did. So what he did was he got, the infamous little Albert, brought him into his laboratory. That wasn't his real name, by the way, they just named him little Albert for the study. But he brought him into his laboratory, and at first, he introduced a bunch of neutral things into the atmosphere to little Albert. So he started having play with different animals like rabbits, dogs, rats, et cetera. And he noticed that, Albert had no reaction whatsoever to these animals. So he would play with the animal just like he would play with a toy. There was no reaction whatsoever. It wasn't positive, wasn't negative. It was just completely neutral. The kid had no problem with the animals. So he's like, all right, now we found our neutral thing in the environment. So that's going to be our conditioned stimulus. Now I need to find something because I'm trying to teach this kid to be afraid. So I need to find something that naturally causes fear in this infant. So he's like, what can I find that will cause natural fear in this child? And what he decided, lo and behold, was that if he banged a hammer against a steel plate behind the kid's head, then the kid will not know where the heck that sound came from and the kid will become afraid. So he started banging that hammer every single time the rat was brought into the room. And lo and behold, guess what happened to poor little Albert? Poor little Albert became afraid of not just the white rat that they experimented on this with, but the poor rabbit. He became afraid of every other animal that had fur and every other animal that was white, and then anything that was white, basically. Even like he had a Santa Claus mask, he became afraid of that. He became afraid of white lab coats. He became afraid of just all things white because of the fact that they banged that hammer every single time the rat was in the room. So his experiment worked and it worked a little too well. Um, in addition to this experiment, there were a lot of controversies surrounding what was done. Like, for instance, terrifying an infant was probably not a good idea. In addition to that, there were a few different scandalous things that were going on between Watson and his assistant, and there was a whole bunch of stuff that went on in the background. But what ended up happening in this study was that he found that it did indeed work to induce fear in an infant. So he went on to advertising after he got fired from the university that he worked with. He went on to advertising and he started manipulating us ever since. So now, anytime you see an ad for anything, whether it be on social media, whether it be on a billboard, whether it be on TV commercials, anytime you see any form of advertisement, Watson is one of the people that was the originators of that. All right. So now we're going to go into the next form of learning, which is operant conditioning. So operant conditioning had a similar start um, to classical conditioning, where it started with somebody who was not necessarily in the field of psychology, somebody who wasn't necessarily um, focused on learning or psychology or anything like that. So a man named Edward Thorndike, he was working with cats, and he developed something called a puzzle box. And essentially what he was trying to do was he was trying to see if he could teach cats how to get out of the box, essentially. So you put them inside of a box like what you see there, and the only way they could get out of that box themselves was if they pressed that lever. That lever would then open the door, and then they would be able to get out and get food. As you can see the food bowl on the outside of the cage. So, he put the cats in a box, locked the door, and watched what happened. And what he found was that the cat would, scratch around, hiss, try to do different things, and then eventually they would accidentally step on the lever and the door would open, and then they would go out and get the food, then he would throw them back in the box and see what happened then. And long story short, what he found was that the results were kind of inconclusive, because although the rats, I mean, not the cats, I mean, not the rats, the cats, although they did get out, quicker over time, at the same time, their movements were so erratic that it was difficult to determine whether they were actually learning how to get out or whether they were just accidentally getting out faster every time. So, it was kinda tricky when it came to the cats. But another researcher came along and he said, "I like what you did there with those cats, but I like rats, so I'm gonna work with rats." So B.F. Skinner came along and, he said, "Alright, you started the game, you started this, I'm gonna finish it." So he's the one who actually came up with something called operant conditioning. So Thorndike's study was the start of operant conditioning, but B.F. Skinner is the one that kind of refined the concept of operant conditioning and gave it its name. So what he did was he decided to work with rats and pigeons, and he developed something called a Skinner box. So Thorndike's box was called the puzzle box. Skinner developed what's known as the Skinner box, which was like a box that had a lever once again, but the lever didn't help the rat or the pigeon to get out of the box. What it did was if they pushed the lever, they would get food. And if they did actions that he did not want them to do, they would get electrical shocks applied to them, which is not very nice. But that's what he decided to do, and that's what many scientists have been doing since then. So essentially, his idea for how we learn is that and underneath operant conditioning, you learn by consequence. So if you do something and you receive something that you deem as a reward or a reinforcement for that behavior, then you're probably going to repeat that behavior. And if you do something and you receive something that you perceive as a punishment to that behavior, you're probably going to stop that behavior. That's the idea behind operant conditioning. You learn by consequence. You do something, you get something you like from it, you do it again. You do something, you get something you don't like from it, you stop. That's his idea. Underneath this, he has a couple of different concepts. So he has something called reinforcers or reinforcements, and then punishers or punishments. So a reinforcer is anything that is a stimulus that leads you to continue a behavior. So you can have positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement, but whichever form of reinforcement you have, you are continuing a behavior after you receive that reinforcement. When it comes to punishment or punishers, a punisher is anything that will cause you to stop a behavior or to slow it down. And you can have, just like you can have positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement, you can also have positive punishment and negative punishment. Positive punishment and negative punishment are both designed to get you to stop a behavior. So, oh, and here's just a picture of his Skinner box. So if you could see the little electrical rungs on the bottom, those would actually shock the rat if they were doing something that he didn't want them to do. And then not sure if you could see the lever, but if you see the lever there or the button there, if the rat pushed that button, he would get food, essentially. So back to our discussion. So when it comes to reinforcement and punishment, we already said that reinforcers are designed to continue a behavior, punishments are designed to stop a behavior. We have positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, negative punishment. But either way, a reinforcement is designed to continue a behavior, a punishment is designed to stop the behavior. Positive reinforcement would be adding something to the environment or adding something to the person or to the animal to get them to continue a behavior. So an example of this would be like let's say that you got your learner's permit and you've been driving really good for a couple years or whatever. So your parents decide to buy you a car. An example of that would be positive reinforcement because they're you've been driving well and you've been driving safely. So therefore they buy you a car in hopes that you will continue to do that. Negative reinforcement, on the other hand, is when you are allowed to avoid something that you are trying to avoid or allowed to avoid something that you don't want to encounter in order to get you to continue a behavior. So let's say that you got your learner's permit, you've been driving good and all that. What they might do is say, all right, since you've been driving so good, you don't have to come home at a curfew anymore. So in that case, they're taking away the curfew, which most kids don't like. Most kids want to stay out as long as they want to stay out. They don't want to have to come back home by a certain time if they're having fun with their friends or whatever. So the parents are like, "All right, since you've been so safe, don't have to have a curfew." So they're avoiding something that they dislike, which is the curfew, because they're being rewarded for driving safely, essentially. And the idea behind it is that if you continue to these safe behaviors, will continue to take away those things that you don't like. Punishment, on the other hand, is designed to stop a behavior. So, for example, positive punishment is when you are adding something or inflicting something on a person to get them to stop a behavior. So, for example, let's say you've been driving a car, but you started acting up. Now you done got a speeding ticket. Now you done got parking tickets. Now you done got pulled over for the police. You indulge in a few activities. So the parents might be like, all right, we're not going to necessarily take the car or anything, but you're about to get some extra chores added to your roster. So now instead of just washing the dishes, now you have to clean the garage. Now you have to go up in the attic and paint it. Now you have to do all this extra stuff around the house because of the fact that we're trying to curb that behavior of you speeding and acting crazy in the car. So, positive punishment, you're adding something negative to get a person to stop doing something that you want them to stop. Negative punishment is when you take something away that the person likes in order to get them to stop doing a behavior. So in this case, let's say that their activities of adding chores to you did not work. And let's say that you're still driving kind of erratically because now you're feeling yourself. Now you got your car, you ain't got no curfew. So now they might say, all right, you ain't driving this car no more. Give us the keys. So if they take the keys from the car, then that is going to kind of really mess you up because now you can't drive anymore. So now they have taken away something that you like, which is the keys to the car, and now you can't drive it anymore because you refuse to stop driving unsafely. So the whole goal was to get you to drive safely, but since you weren't driving safely, they took the car away. So now you can't drive at all. So positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, both of those are designed to continue a behavior. Positive punishment, negative punishment, those are designed to stop behavior. All right. Now, observational learning is the final form of learning. And observational learning is the easiest one. It doesn't have a whole lot of steps to it. Essentially, what happens to observational learning is you see somebody do something and you copy them. So, watching somebody do something and then you copy what they do. The researcher who studied this and who kind of founded the concept of observational learning is Albert Bandura, and he did a series of studies that were underneath the same umbrella. And essentially, what he did was he wanted to see if kids would copy a model's behavior. So if they see a model, whether it be an adult, whether it be another child, whether it be a cartoon character, if they see somebody do something, would they copy that behavior and to what degree would they copy that behavior and what conditions would they copy that behavior? So essentially what he did was he had them watch an adult model at first. He had them watch an adult model go into a room and beat up a blow up doll, basically. The blow up doll's name was Bobo. So they went into the room, they beat up Bobo, banged it on the ground, threw it around, called it names, all that kind of stuff. Then they would leave the room. And then a child would go into the room and they would be left alone with the doll and with other toys. And they would want to see what the kid would do. And naturally, as you can probably imagine, what ended up happening was as soon as that kid was in that room alone with that doll, they did the same thing that the adults did and they actually ended up doing more because the adults would like, just beat up the doll, but the kids would grab weapons and try to like actually maim the doll or kill the doll. The adults might, call the doll a few names and say bang and pow, pop when they're hitting it. The kids would be like cussing at the doll and doing all kinds of other stuff. So basically the kids repeated what the adult did and they did even worse. And that's what he found from this study. Another thing that he found was that the reaction that the adult got after beating up Bobo would also influence what the kid would do when they saw Bobo. So, for example, if the adult got rewarded for beating up Bobo, then the kid would be going full force at Bobo when they encountered him. If they saw the adult get punished for beating up Bobo, the kid would leave Bobo alone and start playing with the other toys. So it showed that there was a direct connection between what a child sees and what a child does. So if a child sees somebody else do something, they're going to want to mimic that behavior. And that continues not just through childhood, but it also continues into adulthood as well, especially with the reinforcement and punishment. What is responsible for this? What actually helps us do this? So part of it is just natural human behavior. We learn by seeing other people do stuff, just like we learn through classical and operant conditioning. Observational learning is a classic form of learning that we engage in. But as far as the brain is considered, or as far as the brain is concerned, mirror neurons in our brain actually help play a critical role in allowing us to have the ability to copy what we see. So, for example, there's areas in the frontal lobe, which is in the front of your brain, which is why it's called the frontal lobe, and the parietal lobe, which is like the top middle of your brain. They actually are activated when you're watching somebody do a certain task. And what they do is, as long as the task is like simple enough and easy enough to repeat, what ends up happening is it stores that memory in your brain so that when it's time for you to do that task, you can do it pretty seamlessly. Now, if the task is like something complex, like for instance, you're watching a gymnastics routine from the Olympics on TV and you see somebody do like 7 backflips and 4 front flips and then a twist, you're probably not gonna be able to do that unless you're a natural Olympian or something like that. You're probably not gonna be able to do that. But if you just watch somebody, close a door, you're gonna learn how to close the door because that's not a difficult task. All you have to do is close the door. Or watching somebody raise their hand to ask a question in class, things like that. Those are not difficult tasks. So as long as you're watching something that's simple, complex, easy to pay attention to, easy to not too many steps attached to it, it'll make it much easier for you to repeat that behavior later on. So that's the basic process of learning, and those were the three different forms of learning that we talk about in this chapter. Now we're gonna go over to the forum, and we're gonna talk about what the assignment is. So for chapter 7, it says using the concepts you learned in chapter 7, create your own examples of classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning, and then comment on two classmates. So come up with your own example. Make sure that your examples are clear. So if you're going to say that something is classical conditioning, make it clear that this is classical conditioning and clearly show how it's classical conditioning. Same thing with operant conditioning and same thing with observational learning. And then once you're done, just comment on two classmates, and that's it. So that is the assignment. That is the forum, and we're done with another week. Come back soon with another one.